It all started innocently enough, as these things often do. My husband, Peter, and I had been married for nearly a decade, and life had settled into a comfortable routine. Peter's nephew, Jacob, had just graduated from college and was looking for a job. Since he was trying to save money, Peter suggested he stay with us for a few weeks while he figured out his next move. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, Jacob had always been the quiet one. At family gatherings, polite but distant. He was just a kid when I first met him, and even now, in his mid-20s, he still had that boyish charm. At first, having Jacob around the house didn't disrupt things much. He was respectful, stayed out of our way, and spent most of his time applying for jobs. I would occasionally bump into him in the kitchen, or while he was lounging in the living room. But our interactions were brief. I was busy with my own life, managing my work, keeping the house in order, and maintaining my marriage. But something shifted a few weeks into his stay. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and Peter had gone out to meet some friends. I was alone in the house with Jacob, who was quietly reading on the couch in the living room. I remember the moment vividly. I walked in to grab a book and noticed him glancing up at me, his eyes lingering just a bit too long. There was a spark, something I hadn't expected, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. But as the days went by, I started noticing subtle changes in Jacob's behavior. He would find excuses to be in the same room as me, whether it was asking for advice on his job search or offering to help with chores. His compliments became more personal, and his presence, once so neutral, began to feel charged. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, or if there really was something unspoken passing between us. It wasn't long before Peter began working late, more often leaving Jacob and me alone in the house for extended periods with each passing day. I became more aware of his presence, of the tension building in the air. It was as if the house itself had started to hum with an energy neither of us could ignore. We never touched, never said anything inappropriate. But the silence between us grew heavier with each passing hour. One evening, after Peter had gone out again, Jacob and I found ourselves in the kitchen together. I was cooking dinner, and he offered to help, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Our hands brushed as we passed each other ingredients, and in that moment, I realized that this was more than just an innocent attraction. Something dangerous was brewing between us, something I wasn't sure I was prepared to confront. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound casual as I handed him a plate. "You've been really helpful around the house." Jacob smiled, that same boyish grin I'd seen 100 times before. But this time it felt different. "It's nothing," he said, his voice soft. "I like being around you." I didn't know how to respond. The air between us felt thick, almost suffocating, and for the first time, I realized just how close we had come to crossing a line we could never uncross. But we hadn't, not yet anyway. After that night in the kitchen, I began to notice Jacob more. His presence in the house, once so easy to overlook, now seemed almost magnetic. I told myself that I was being ridiculous. He was my husband's nephew, for heaven's sake. But the more I tried to convince myself that nothing was happening, the more I felt pulled toward him. Peter, blissfully unaware of the tension simmering between Jacob and me, continued his late work nights. The silence in the house when he wasn't there felt different now. Less like peace and more like temptation. Jacob and I still kept things polite and casual on the surface, but the unspoken undercurrent was always there, threatening to pull us under. It wasn't until the weekend that things started to spiral. Peter had gone on an overnight trip for work, and I found myself alone with Jacob once again. I had made plans with some friends, but they fell through at the last minute, leaving me restless and on edge. Jacob, sensing my mood, suggested we watch a movie together. I hesitated. It felt like crossing a line, even though technically it was just a movie. But I didn't want to appear paranoid or awkward. So I agreed. We sat in the living room, side by side on the couch, with the TV glowing in front of us. At first it was easy enough to focus on the film, but as the minutes ticked by, I became more aware of how close we were sitting. The way his arm brushed against mine when he reached for the remote. The soft sounds of his breathing. Halfway through the movie, I felt him shift closer. My heart began to race, and I told myself I should get up, make some excuse, and leave the room. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed motionless as the space between us disappeared. There was nothing overtly inappropriate in his actions, but the intensity of the moment was unmistakable. I really appreciate you being here, Jacob said suddenly, his voice low. I've been feeling pretty lost lately, but being around you, it makes me feel like things will be okay. I wasn't sure how to respond. There was a sincerity in his words, a vulnerability that caught me off guard. I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be fine. But I also knew that I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. You've been through a lot, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's normal to feel uncertain right now. He looked at me then, his eyes dark and intense. It's more than that, he said softly. I don't know how to explain it, but I've never felt this way before. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The moment I had been dreading and anticipating all at once. I knew I had to shut it down, to create distance before things went too far. But instead, I found myself frozen. Unable to speak, unable to move. Jacob leaned in his face inches from mine. My heart pounded in my chest, as the air between us seemed to crackle with tension. He wasn't touching me, but the closeness felt more intimate than any physical contact could have. I stood abruptly, breaking the moment. I need to check on something in the kitchen, I said quickly, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. Jacob blinked, momentarily surprised, but then nodded. Yeah, of course. I'll pause the movie. I rushed out of the living room, my mind racing. What was I doing? How would I allowed things to get this far? In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to study my breathing. I needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. But even as I stood there trying to collect myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that the line we had been so carefully towing was about to be crossed. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, pretending to fuss over things that didn't matter, rearranging the utensils, wiping down a spotless counter. Anything to avoid going back into that room. My thoughts raced in every direction, conflicting emotions swirling in my chest. Guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. How would I let this happen? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? Eventually, I knew I couldn't hide any longer. Taking a deep breath, I studied myself and walked back into the living room. Jacob was sitting on the couch where I had left, his posture tense, but he looked up when I entered, offering a small, almost apologetic smile. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he said quietly. I didn't mean to. His words hung in the air between us, and I could tell he was waiting for some sort of reassurance, some sign that everything was okay. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if everything could be okay after this. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that we were both standing on the edge of something. The question was, would either of us step back, or would we fall? I think we need to be careful, I finally said, choosing my words carefully. We're both in a difficult place right now, and it's easy to confuse things. Jacob looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. I know, he murmured. I didn't mean to make things complicated. It's just, I've always felt like I could talk to you. Like you understand me in a way no one else does. That confession caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how deep his feelings ran, and the weight of his words stirred something inside me. But I couldn't allow myself to dwell on that. This was wrong, I knew it. We both did. I needed to stop this before it went any further. Jacob, you're Peter's nephew, I said, my voice firmer now. We can't do this, whatever this is. It can't happen. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at me for what felt like an eternity, as if he were searching for something in my eyes. Then slowly he nodded, accepting the truth we both knew, but hadn't yet spoken aloud. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by an unexpected pain of sadness. There was a part of me that had wanted him to fight, to argue, to make me feel like this connection we had was something more than just a fleeting mistake. But of course that would have been a lie, and I knew that. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us still thick, but now tinged with something else. An understanding that this was the moment we had to make a choice, and in that quiet space, with the movie still paused on the screen, it became clear that the choice had already been made. I think I'm going to go to bed, I said, finally standing up and avoiding his gaze. It's late and we've both had a long day. Jacob nodded again, not saying anything as I turned and walked. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Not if I wanted to keep the fragile control I had managed to regain. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment from the evening. What had just happened felt surreal, like a scene from a movie, rather than something from my own life, and yet as real as it had been. I knew I had to let it go, for the sake of my marriage, for the sake of my sanity. I had to bury this before it became something much worse. But sleep didn't come easily. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story between Jacob and me wasn't over yet. The days after that night felt strange, like I was living in some parallel reality where nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything felt different beneath. Jacob and I avoided each other as much as possible. When we did cross paths, we exchanged polite, awkward greetings, pretending that the tension between us didn't exist, but it was always there, just under the surface, like a silent storm waiting to break. Peter returned from his trip the next day, blissfully unaware of what had transpired. In his absence, he slipped back into our normal routine, as though nothing had changed. And in some ways nothing had, but in others, everything had shifted. Jacob, for his part, seemed quieter than usual. He spent most of his time out of the house, either at job interviews or at a nearby coffee shop where he worked on his resume. Part of me was relieved by the distance. It gave me time to breathe, to reflect on what had nearly happened. But another part of me, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, missed him, missed the intensity of what we had shared, even if it had never crossed the line into something physical. A few days later, I found myself alone in the house again. Peter was working late and Jacob had gone out, or so I thought. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when I heard the front door quietly click shut. My heart skipped a beat. Jacob was back. I didn't know what I expected or what I wanted. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for another confrontation. Not so soon. I was about to slip upstairs when Jacob appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. His voice low but firm. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. I knew this conversation was inevitable, but I had been hoping to avoid it a little longer. Jacob walked into the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, as if he didn't quite belong there. I sat across from him, keeping a safe distance. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Jacob finally said, breaking the quiet, "and I think I need to leave." The words hit me like a punch. I hadn't expected him to say that. Leave. Where would he go? Was this because of me? "I don't want you to feel like you have to go," I said quickly, my voice catching your family. "Jacob, you don't have to leave because of what almost happened." He finished my sentence for me, his eyes locking onto mine. "We both know it's the right thing. I can't stay here pretending everything's fine. When it's not, I've made things complicated for you, and I need to take responsibility for that." His words were mature, thoughtful, and they made my chest tighten with a mix of guilt and something else, something I didn't want to name. He was right, of course. His presence in the house had become a ticking time bomb, and we both knew that sooner or later something would give. The only way to defuse it was for one of us to leave. "You're not responsible for everything," I said softly. "We both played a part in this." Jacob shook his head. "Maybe, but I'm the one who made things harder for you. Peter, trust me." And I let that trust down. Hearing Peter's name was like a cold splash of water, a reminder of the man who had no idea what had been brewing under his own roof. The shame of it all hit me hard, and I knew, deep down, that Jacob was doing the right thing. As much as I wanted to believe we could go back to how things were before, the truth was that we couldn't. Not now. "When are you leaving?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've got a friend in the city," Jacob said. "I'll crash with him for a while, until I figure things out. I'll tell Peter it's because I found a job opportunity there, something that makes sense." It was a clean exit, one that would spare Peter from ever knowing how close we had come to disaster. But as I sat there listening to Jacob lay out his plan, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sadness. We had made the right choice, but it still felt like a loss. "I'll miss having you around," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. Jacob gave me a small, sad smile. "I'll miss you too. But this is for the best." We sat in silence for a moment longer, both of us knowing that this, the end of whatever had been building between us. There would be no dramatic farewell, no last-minute confessions, just a quiet understanding that this was the right thing to do, even if it hurt. Jacob stood, and I followed him to the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused, turning to face me one last time. "I hope you'll be okay," he said softly. "I will," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. And with that, Jacob opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the tension, the temptation, and the complicated mess we had nearly fallen into. I watched him walk down the driveway, disappearing into the shadows, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. When Peter came home later that night, he kissed me on the cheek, completely unaware of the weight had just been lifted from our lives. I smiled back at him, knowing that what had almost happened would remain a secret, a story that would never be told. And in the quiet of our home, I realized that we had all escaped something dangerous, something that could have changed everything.